So hello students, today I'll be teaching you the development of face. So in the development of face, our specific learning objectives are you should be able to describe the development of facial primordia separately, and then you should be able to enumerate their derivatives. Then you should be able to describe the development of salivary glands, describe the development of oral and the nasal cavities. You should be able to describe the development of palate and related anomalies. And then you should also be able to describe the various craniofacial syndromes related to the arches, the pharyngeal arches. So before I start my class, I'll give you a brief account of what we are going to study. So this is a 4-week-old embryo, the lateral view. This one is the nasal pit. What I'm drawing is the medial nasal process. And then is our oral cavity or the primitive stomodium. Then is our developing pharyngeal arch zone. Then I'll complete the developing embryo. Then next I'm going to draw uh, our forebrain, midbrain and the hind. That is the neural tube. So over here, this one is the our forebrain vesicle, the midbrain and the hindbrain vesicle. This one is the continuation of the neural tube. So this neural tube, it will give pathway from these vesicles will migrate the neural crest cells which will contribute to the mesenchyme of head and neck region. Then since this one is the stomodium, so in its close proximity will be our buccopharyngeal this foregut which is lined by this buccopharyngeal membrane. And here is our developing pharyngeal arches, first, second, third, fourth, fifth one will be disappearing, and so on are pharyngeal arches. So this one is the epicardial ridge. So since this one is the nasal pit, so we'll take a cross section over here. So in the development of face, there is appearance of the 5 facial primordia. So one facial primordia is a frontonasal prominence. So this one is the frontonasal prominence, which has a frontal part and a nasal part. What I've made is a nasal part. The frontal part is somewhat expanded and it is forming the forehead region, which will form the forehead region. These are the optic vesicles. Now, what are optic vesicles? These are extension of this forebrain and it will form the future eye. So these are on the sides initially. So over here in this embryo, here will be the optic vesicle. Then is the first pair of facial primordia which will appear will be the mandibular prominence, since it is derived from the first pharyngeal arch, that is the mandibular arch, and the cartilage is the Meckel's cartilage, and secondly will be the our maxillary prominence along with the frontonasal prominence. So these are the which I am making is the maxillary prominence, which is also derived from the first pharyngeal arch, and the cartilage of this arch is the palato quadrate bar. So we have a pair of maxillary prominences, a pair of mandibular prominence, and a frontonasal prominence. So what I've made this one is the inferolateral part. So at the inferolateral part, there is proliferation of the lining ectoderm. So all these prominences, they have core of mesenchyme, and outermost they are lined by ectoderm. So when there is a proliferation at inferolateral part, it will give rise to the formation of nasal placodes. Nasal placodes, which is a thickened part of the ectoderm. Now, as these nasal placodes are formed, what happens next? The mesenchyme of the surrounding part of this eminence, it will start proliferating. So now what picture you will have is, so since the surrounding mesenchyme starts proliferating, so it will turn this placode into a pit. So this pits will divide this nasal prominence into a lateral nasal prominence and a medial nasal prominence. So we will now have a pair of lateral nasal prominences and a pair of medial nasal prominences. Again, here will be the developing eyes. And here now the maxillary prominence, it has started coming towards each other. So this one is the maxillary prominence, and in the midline will be the mandibular prominence. So mandibular prominence will now, it will form the caudal boundary of this stomodium. This one is the stomodium. These are the nasal pits. Now the placodes have been converted into the nasal pits. These are the maxillary prominence. Then what happens? All these prominences, since they are lined by ectoderm, so a ectodermal thickening or a groove, it starts developing from the optic vesicle along the this lateral nasal prominence. So now what will be the picture like? And because of the growth of this maxillary prominences towards the medial side, so these medial nasal prominences, they have started shifting towards each other. And here, as the eyes will also start receding on the near the midline. This is the mandibular prominence, and this one is the maxillary prominence which have receded, and this one is the thickening along this nasolabial groove. So a nasolabial groove is formed, or a naso-optic furrow is formed on both the sides along the lateral nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence. So this naso-optic furrow will give rise to the nasolacrimal duct. The median nasal prominences will give rise to primary palate, the intermaxillary part, and the philtrum of the upper lip. Maxillary prominences will contribute to the most of the portion of the upper lip and the palate. The mandibular prominence will form the lower jaw and the lower lip. So now I will, with this brief review, I will start my class. So a facial primordia, I told you, it appear in 4th week around this stomodium. This one is the stomodium. So 5 facial primordia, the core of which is mainly mesenchymal, and outermost it is lined by ectoderm. And this core of mesenchyme is derived from the neural crest cells, which have migrated from the midbrain and the hindbrain vesicles. So on the inferior-lateral part of this one frontonasal prominence, there was a thickening of the ectoderm, which is known as nasal plecodes or olfactory nasal plecodes. Then there are 5 facial primordia. So one is the frontonasal prominence, then a paired maxillary prominence, and a paired mandibular prominence. So facial development occurs mainly between 4th to 8th week of intrauterine life. So firstly, we'll consider one process one by one. So first one is the mandibular prominence. So this one is the mandibular prominence. So its derivatives are lower jaw and the lower lip. So since it is derived from the first pharyngeal arch, this one is the first prominence to appear. Now it uh, when these two mandibular prominence, they approach towards each other in the midline, it will result in their fusion and thus formation of the lower jaw and the lower lip. And if these two mandibular prominences, they fail to fuse with each other, then it results in the formation of a common chin dimple. So a chin dimple results from incomplete fusion of these two mandibular prominences. So in a nutshell, what is the derivatives of the mandibular prominences or the mandibular process? One is the lower lip and the adjoining part of the cheek. Then is the alveolar process with the tooth parts and the tongue. Now the frontonasal prominence. So this one is the green one is the frontonasal prominence. So it has got a frontal part which will form the forehead of the face, and it has got a nasal part which will form the rostral boundary of the stomodium and the nose. So what is the fate of nasal prominence? So in the nasal prominence, we will be discussing the development of the nasal plecodes, that is because of the ectodermal thickening, then development of nasal pits or olfactory gutter because of the mesenchymal proliferation, then what are the different components contributing to the external nose, then how the nasolacrimal groove and duct is formed, and the formation of the intermaxillary segment, which is also an important component of the primary palate. So firstly, how the nasal plecodes are formed. So around 4th week, there are bilateral oval thickenings of the ectoderm on the lateral part of the frontonasal prominence. So this is known as nasal plecodes. Then initially, as you can see in this figure, because of the proliferation of the ectoderm, these nasal plecodes, they are convex. But with the due course of time, the surrounding mesenchyme also starts proliferating. So these nasal plecodes, firstly they get stretched up and then they start sinking in the underlying mesenchyme, producing the adjacent elevated parts. So it will give rise to a median nasal prominence and a lateral nasal prominence around a nasal pit. So this is of the one side. So we will get a pair of median nasal prominence and a pair of lateral nasal prominences surrounding the nasal pits, which will form our future anterior nares or the nostrils. Now comes the external nose. So these pits forms the primordia for the anterior nares or the nostrils. So these are the anterior nares or the nostrils. Then, so the nose, it is formed by 5 facial prominences. The frontal prominence, which will give rise to bridge. This one is the bridge of the nose. Then the merged medial nasal prominences, they will provide the origin of crest and the tip of the nose, and the lateral nasal prominences, they will form the alley of the nose. Now the nasolacrimal groove, how it is formed. Now there is proliferation of the mesenchyme of the maxillary prominences. Then because of this proliferation, these maxillary prominence, they will start approaching towards each other. So with their approaching, with their movement towards each other, they will also start compressing this median nasal prominences towards each other in the mid plane. So it when they will approach towards each other, there is a line formed which is extending. The fusion with the lateral nasal prominence is along a line which extends from this eye or the optic vesicle to the stomodium. So this groove, it is known as nasolacrimal groove, which appears between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary prominence. Sorry. So each lateral prominence, this one is the lateral prominence, it is separated from this maxillary prominence by a cleft, which is known as nasolacrimal groove or naso-optic furrow. Why naso-optic? Because it is extending from optic vesicle till the lateral nasal prominence. So now all these, if you remember, these prominences, they are lined by ectoderm. So approaching part are also ectodermally lined. So by the end of 6th week, each maxillary prominence, they will start merge with this lateral nasal prominence along this nasolacrimal groove, and this is also ectodermally lined. So over here you can see this is a bed in the B part, that is around 6th week, a clear-cut nasolacrimal groove or duct or a furrow has been formed. So the nasolacrimal duct, it develops from a rod-like thickening of the ectoderm in the floor of nasolacrimal groove. So since a groove will form, there will be thickening of the overlying ectoderm. So this will form a nasolacrimal groove, and when this thickened cord, it will be recanalized because of the programmed cell death of the lining ectodermal cells. It will convert this groove into a nasolacrimal duct. So this nasolacrimal duct, it extends from the medial side of the eye till the lateral wall of the nose. When they will fuse, the maxillary prominence will fuse with the lateral nasal process. This nasolacrimal duct will get submerged inside it. So the superior end of the duct, it expands to form a lacrimal sac, and the inferior end will open into the inferior meatus in the postnatal life. So it will act as a draining channel for the lacrimal fluid. Now this duct becomes patent completely after the birth. So because of its passage from the medial canthus of the eye to the inferior meatus, it explains why some people get a runny nose while crying. Because of the excessive formation of the lacrimal fluid, it is constantly being drained into the inferior meatus. Now is the formation of the intermaxillary segment, which is formed by the merging of the two median nasal prominences. Now this median nasal prominence, it will move towards each other because of this proliferation of the maxillary prominences. So this merged median nasal prominence give rise to an intermaxillary segment, which will contribute to the philtrum of the upper lip, the premaxillary part of the maxilla, which is a part of the upper jaw carrying the upper four incisors, and the primary palate, which is in front of the incisive foramina. So it has got a labial component, a jaw component, and a palatal component. So now the maxillary prominence, which will give rise to the upper lip. So the uh, maxillary prominence, mainly it contributes to the formation of the upper lip and the palatine shells, not the intermaxillary segment, which is a part of the frontonasal prominence. Now the formation of upper lip. And between the 7th and 10th week, the medial nasal prominence, they will merge with the lateral nasal prominences. So because of the merging of this medial and the lateral nasal prominence, it will result in the continuity of the upper jaw and lip and separation of nasal pits from the stomodium. So upper lip is entirely formed from the maxillary prominences except the philtrum, which is contributed by the intermaxillary segment. So that is why intermaxillary segment has to be mentioned in the formation of upper lip, which is contributing to the philtrum part of the upper lip. So to summarize, what are the derivatives of the different prominences? So a frontonasal prominence will give rise to forehead, to the bridge of the nose, the medial and the lateral nasal prominences. Then the maxillary prominence will give rise to cheeks, the lateral portion of the upper lip. Then the median nasal prominence, it will give rise to philtrum of the upper lip, the crest, and the tip of the nose. The lateral nasal prominence will give rise to alley of the nose, and the mandibular prominence will give rise to the lower lip. Now, the parts which are derived from the frontonasal prominence is supplied by the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. That derived from the maxillary prominence will be supplied by the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, and that supplied by the mandibular derived from the mandibular prominence will be supplied by the mandibular division of the the trigeminal nerve. Now the external ear. So the external ear, the primordia of the auricles. So over here you can now you can see it better, the better look. This one is the lateral view. So over here is our first pharyngeal groove. So at by the end of the 5th week, the primordia of the auricle, they will begin, they will appear. Then what happened? 6 auricular hillocks, they will develop along the pharyngeal groove, the auricular primordia, and the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus was derived from the first pharyngeal cleft. So a pair of six auricular hillocks will appear on each side. So how the external ear is formed? So the fusion of these auricular hillocks will give rise to the external ear, and with the development of this mandibular prominence, with the development of the cheek, it will give rise. It will cause the ascending of this external ear at the level of eyes. Earlier, the ears were located in the neck region, and with the development of the maxillary and the mandibular prominence, they will ascend up into the head region at the level of eyes. So that is why they will ascend upwards. They will take away with their sensory cutaneous supply, that is the great auricular nerve and the lesser occipital nerve. When you will steady the external ear, you will be studying about its cutaneous supply. So, and the root value is C2 and C3. So that explains, because its initial position was in the neck, and later on it is migrated into the head region. So over here, you can have a better look of the ascending ears. Earlier, it is in the neck region, and later on, it has reached till the level of eyes. So that was all in this session.